So welcome to all of you. Welcome to our session on how to copy edit for clarity. My name is Hayley and I am the head of education at ProWritingAid. It's so great to meet those of you who I don't know already, and so good to see some familiar faces here as well. Today, we are going to be talking about copy editing and specifically how to copy edit for clarity. So the three things that we are going to do on today's session are: first, learn why clarity is the most important goal for all writers. Then we're going to talk about 5 principles that will help make your writing more clear. And then finally, you will learn how to apply those principles to your writing to make it more effective. And I just want to say from the top, if you are, as we kind of get into the application section, we will be talking about how to use ProWritingAid to apply these principles to your writing. But that being said, if you don't have ProWritingAid, no worries at all. I will teach you how to apply these principles even if you don't have it. And then if you don't have ProWritingAid, but you're interested in having ProWritingAid, I am offering a 25% off discount for ProWritingAid yearly and lifetime subscriptions, which I'm just going to put in the chat. I'll put it out again later as well. And just like Patricia says, all writers should own ProWritingAid. And I'll show you how to use it today and then answer some questions on that as we go. And again, before we go into the content, we're going to cover a lot today. And I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat and then answer questions towards the end. That being said, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box as opposed to the chat. I do try to keep an eye on the chat, but it tends to move fairly quickly. So if you want to make sure that I don't miss it, please put it into the Q&A box. Okay. All that housekeeping being taken care of, let's just go ahead and dive in because we have a lot to talk about. So clarity, why is clarity so important? Clarity is an essential part of storytelling because if your writing is not clear, your work is not going to engage readers. So as writers, our main job is to get our meaning across clearly, effectively. And when our writing is too complicated or too hard to follow, that means that we're not doing our job. And as fiction writers, it can be really easy to forget about clarity when you're worrying about so many other pieces. You're worrying about characterization, about plot, about setting. It can be really easy to forget about the sentences and how they're set up and what effect that can have on their readers. But it's so important when you get to the line editing and copy editing stage of writing to make sure that you're really zooming in and taking a look at those sentences to make sure they're set up as effectively as possible. If those sentences are ineffective or are unclear, our readers are going to spend more time trying to figure out what we're saying than actually engaging with our ideas. And that's honestly very heartbreaking for me to think about as a fiction writer, that, I could spend hours and hours and months and weeks, coming up with plot and coming up with really amazing characters. And then my readers just don't even engage with them because my sentences are not set up effectively, right? So we need to not just have great ideas and a great plot and great characters, but we also need to make sure that our sentences, which are basically the vehicles for those ideas to get to our readers, that those are clear and following a logical path. Good writing is always going to prioritize clearly communicating ideas over showing off fancy, confusing language. And this is something that I personally struggled a lot with, particularly as I was newer to writing, because I always thought that I had to, show off my vocabulary and create like really complicated sentences to write beautifully or to write in a way that would engage readers. But again, really good writing is not about just creating complicated sentences or using fancy words just for the sake of that. It's about getting those ideas across in the most effective way possible. So I've thrown the term clarity around a bunch of times already, and I want to just make sure that we're all kind of clear on the definition of clarity before we move forward. So when I'm talking about clarity, I'm talking about 3 things. First, I'm talking about how easy your writing is to understand. Now, that is going to be something that is on a sliding scale and is different for every reader. So what's easy for me to understand might be different than what's easy for someone else on this webinar to understand, because we all come to different texts with different background knowledge, different vocabularies, different experiences, right? So every single text, every single person reading a text is going to have a slightly different entry into that. So when we think about clarity, we need to think about how easy your writing is to understand and how it relates to your readers. So clarity is, again, first, how easy your writing is to understand. Second, whether or not your sentences are set up in a reader-focused way. And again, like I just mentioned, every single reader or group of readers is going to have a slightly different set of understanding. So my readers are going to be slightly different than Sherry's in the chat. Because we're writing potentially for different audiences. So clarity is going to be this sliding scale that you apply to your specific set of readers. So what makes something clear is not going to be the same across the board. It is going to be a sliding scale that you have to apply to your specific text and your specific audience. Now, clarity is finally using rich and specific language that adds to your reader's understanding. And I think this point is really important to focus on before we move forward, because a lot of times when I talk about clarity, people worry that I'm just talking about making sentences super, super, super simple, subject, verb, that's it. That could not be further from the case. Clarity is about creating simple, effective sentences, but it's also about using rich and specific language. It's both and, it's not either or. So you will use simple, effective sentences that have rich and specific language. You might choose to use certain types of rich and specific language over others based on who your audience is, which I'll teach you in a little bit, but you're going to always have simple, effective sentences and rich and specific language. It has to be both. It can't just be one or another. Okay, so that's what clarity is. So it's how easy your writing is to understand, whether or not you set your sentences up in a reader-focused way, and then finally, whether or not you're using rich and specific language that adds to your audience's understanding. On the other hand, clarity has nothing to do with how simple or juvenile your ideas are, or whether or not your prose is unique, engaging, and exciting. So a lot of times I get people who are really worried that if they have very simple sentences, that means that their ideas are simple. That could not be further from the case. You can have really complex, complicated ideas while still having simple, clear sentences. And in a lot of cases, the more complex your ideas are, the more your sentences might actually need to be simple to make sure your readers are not misunderstanding you. And then finally, your prose does not have to be boring to be clear. Your prose can still be engaging, it can still be unique, it can still use rich and specific language while still being clear. And we'll talk about how to do that today. So how do we get to clarity now that we know what it is? Clarity always starts with your sentences. You have to start at the sentence level, and at this stage of the editing process, really zoom into each individual sentence in order to make sure your writing is clear. And that's because sentences are like mini movies. Every sentence is a complete story in itself. So you want to think of each sentence you're writing as a mini movie your reader is playing in their head. If that movie is wrong, the next movie that comes after it, the next sentence might be a little bit wrong as well, and that will kind of compound. So we really have to look at each sentence as a complete story, and that complete story needs to be clear in order for our whole story to be clear. So when we have clear sentences, we will have clear paragraphs. When we have clear paragraphs, we will have clear stories. It's really hard to get to a clear story if your sentences are unclear. So that's why we zoom in when we're talking about clarity to each individual sentence, because we cannot get to a clear story if every sentence is a little bit confusing. So how do we write clear sentences? These are my 5 principles to copy edit with clarity. The first thing you have to do is make your subjects your stars. The second thing you need to do is reduce glue words. The third thing you need to do is use powerful verbs in your writing. The fourth is target the correct readability for your audience. And the fifth is to choose specific words. Now, don't worry about getting all of this down now. I am going to go into detail about each and every single one of these, but I wanted to give you a preview of what the 5 elements you should be looking at are before we get into each. And again, as I get into this section, I'm going to talk about what each of these elements is, how to identify and fix it, and then I'm also going to show you how to fix this with ProWritingAid, though again, I will also show you how to fix it if you don't have ProWritingAid either. So let's go ahead and get into principle 1. So principle 1 is to make your subjects the stars of your sentences. So what does that mean? Subjects are the stars of your sentences. They are the focus of your sentence. They are the main actors in your text, and it's really important to prioritize them. If you have written a sentence with passive voice, that means that you've put the object of your subject before the subject of your sentence. Passive voice takes the power away from your subjects, putting your subjects out of the starring role. So here's an example of a passive voice sentence. The present was opened by Jane. So this sentence and this image that accompanies it shows exactly kind of what happens when you use passive voice. So in this sentence, the present is the object. It's the thing being acted upon. It's the thing being opened. And it comes before Jane in this sentence. So it's kind of like what we see in this photo here, where the present takes is like the first thing you think about, right? And then Jane is kind of in the background because she's way at the end of the sentence. So if we go back to that concept that a sentence is like a mini movie, if we read this very, very slowly, the present was opened by Jane, that movie would show the present first, again, like this image does, and then Jane comes in all the way at the end. Now, doing this is often going to get in the way of your reader. Now, obviously, this sentence, the present was opened by Jane, is very, very simple. It's not going to get too much in the way of your reader's understanding. But the longer and more complicated your sentences are, the more passive voice can negatively affect your readers. So passive voice is often too wordy and too confusing because, again, it prioritizes the object of the sentence over the subject of the sentence. All of that being said, passive voice is not grammatically incorrect. So you can use passive voice and you won't see it flagged in something like Google Docs or, a typical spell checker because, again, it's totally fine. Like it's grammatically correct. So, but what I want us to think about today is not that passive voice is wrong, but that we need to be careful about when we use passive voice. So it's not grammatically incorrect. It can be used. We can use it, but we need to think about when. And for many of us as writers, passive voice becomes a bad habit that we're not actively choosing when to use it or when to not use it. We just kind of do it without thinking about it, which is the important part. When we're thinking about passive voice, we need to think about making sure it makes sense in a particular context rather than deciding to just kind of use it because, we didn't realize that it was there. So here are 3 instances when I do think it is okay to use. The first is if the subject of your sentence is unknown. So you can't have a sentence where the subject is the star if the subject is unknown. So if you say something like Stonehenge was built, a million years ago, we don't know who built Stonehenge. So there's nobody to build it. We can't say, aliens built Stonehenge because we don't know, right? So in this sentence, it makes sense to use passive voice because we don't know who built it. Another example is in a sentence where the subject is irrelevant, right? So we have, in our second example, the Time and Life building was constructed in 1959. In this sentence, it's not important to say who constructed it because that's not what the sentence is about. It's about how it changed the New York City skyline, right? So you can think about using passive voice when it's not really important who the subject is. You may also choose to use passive voice deliberately if you want to create suspicion or create a reason for your readers to kind of ask, oh, who, So in this particular example, Mary realized a suspicious package had been left on her door. Mary doesn't know who left the package, and the package is suspicious in this instance, so we probably want to create that suspense. So as a writer here, you're making a deliberate choice to not focus on the subject or of the subject of who had left the package, because again, you're trying to create that kind of suspicion, that question in the reader's mind. Now, this deliberate choice is something that's really, really common in things like newspaper headlines, blog articles, that type of thing. You'll often see something like, this is always a horrible example, but something like person murdered, is often in news headlines. And, a lot of that is passive voice. And it's because they want you to click into the article and read to figure out by whom, right? It's in their interest to not give you all of the information right away because they want you to click and open the article, right? So this is an example, again, of that deliberate choice. So you can use passive voice if, again, your goal as the writer is to get your reader to either be asking a question, so to be like, oh, who, or to take a particular action. In that instance, passive voice is okay. So these are the 3 instances where I recommend that it is okay to use passive voice, but if it's not one of these 3 instances, you might want to consider changing or removing passive sentences and passive constructions from your sentences. So how do you do that? It's very simple to fix passive voice. You simply take the sentence that you had, you take the object that was at the beginning of your sentence, and you switch it with the subject. So we had the present was opened by Jane. Now we have Jane opens the present. Instead of the present being in the forefront, now Jane, the person who is doing the opening, comes in the forefront. So to fix passive voice yourself, if you don't have ProWritingAid, I recommend doing these three things. First, you can look for instances of passive voice by finding the word by. So the present was opened by Jane, or a sentence that could have the word by. So the time in life building was constructed. We could have the word by in there. It's usually a really good indication that you've used the passive voice. You can also look for constructions of to be verbs plus verbs. So was opened. Those are pretty good instances or indications that you've used passive voice. And once you've found one of those instances, you simply have to flip your sentence so the doer comes first. So instead of the present was opened by Jane, Jane opens the presents. That being said, it is very easy to find this with ProWritingAid, which I will show you now. So I am in ProWritingAid right now. I am looking at our real-time checker, which shows multiple different corrections, including passive constructions. So we have one right here. We have a passive voice construction. So ProWritingAid will find these instances of passive voice in your writing. And depending on the construction of the sentence, it might just highlight that you have a passive verb, or it could suggest, let's see if we have one in here. I'm not sure if we do. We could actually try that sentence I just had. And they'll find instances of, passive voice, and then they might also recommend ways to fix it. So you could either see the passive construction like this, or you can have the sentence fixed with recommendations as well. Now, something I want to highlight in this, while we're here looking at passive voice, is that you will see in many of the ProWritingAid suggestions, this little I up here at the top. This I will open up into articles that explain to you more about the suggestion. And then you can click into either watch a video. Let's go back. You can click to watch a video. You can read a full article on it. So if you ever have a question about a suggestion and either how to make the fix, or whether or not you should make the fix or not, those articles can be really, really helpful to making that decision. Okay, so that was our first principle, to make subjects the stars of our sentence. Our second principle is one that people have been talking about in the chat this whole time, so I'm very excited to talk about it. So our second principle is to reduce glue words. So glue words are words that make our sentences stick together, and we'll talk more about them in a second. But what I want us to focus on in this section is prioritizing working words over glue words. So working words are the words that contain a sentence's most essential information. You can't change them, or the meaning of the sentence will change. So a working word tends to be a noun, a verb, an adjective, something that you cannot change or the meaning of the sentence will change. So right now, if I said Hayley delivered a webinar, which is what I'm doing right now, and I changed webinar to pizza, the meaning of the sentence would change. If I changed delivered to skipped, the meaning of the sentence would change. If I changed Hayley to Knox, my dog right there, the meaning of the sentence would change, and potentially the webinar would be way more exciting for all of you if Knox was up here talking instead of me. So again, working words are the words that contain a sentence's most essential information. It's important to keep them in the sentence, or think about how, they fit into the sentence, because if you change them, the meaning of the sentence is going to change, right? So those are working words. Everything else in a sentence is a glue word. So glue words are there, they're real words, they're words that are essential, but their job is to make the pieces of the sentence stick together. You can reduce, remove, or replace them, and the meaning of the sentence will not drastically change. So if I changed my sentence from Hayley delivered a webinar to Hayley delivered the webinar, the meaning of the sentence is not going to really change that much, right? Changing the to a or a to the, that's an example of a glue word, where again, it's not really going to change the meaning of the sentence, though you can decide that, for instance, it's the webinar, so you would like to use, the instead of a, but again, those words will not drastically change your meaning or understanding of a sentence. So working words are the words that you cannot change or the sentence's meaning will change. Glue words are everything that comes around that, again, makes the sentence make sense. They're essential parts of the sentence, but in many instances, you can reduce, remove, or replace them to make the sentence more effective. And why we're talking about this is because when you have too many glue words in a sentence, the sentence becomes sticky. And a sticky sentence is just like it sounds. It's a sentence that is hard for our readers to go through. So here's an example of a sticky sentence. Dave walked over into the backyard of the school in order to see if there was a new bicycle that he could use in his class. I would love to see you put in the chat, I'll give you a couple seconds, what are the working words in this sentence? Again, working, not glue. So what are the words that are essential for this sentence to make sense that we cannot change without changing the meaning of the sentence? I'll give you a few seconds to put them in the chat. The working words. Dave, school, bicycle, class. Dave walked, backyard, school, bicycle. Dave walked, backyard, school, new, bicycle, class. Dave walked, backyard, school, new, bicycle, use, class. Yep, great. Everyone has highlighted exactly the words that I did. So I could not change Dave to Hayley, or the meaning of the sentence would change. I could not change school to hospital, or the meaning of the sentence would change. I could not change bicycle to rollerblades, or the meaning of the sentence would change. I couldn't change class to, after school activities. I don't know. I don't know why else you would use a bicycle. Race, the meaning of the sentence would change, right? So these are all of our working words. We have to keep these, or we have to consider keeping these in order to have the sentence make sense. That means that every other word not highlighted is a glue word. It's there to make the sentence make sense and make it a complete sentence, but there are a lot of glue words here. Our percentage is all off. Again, the sentence isn't incorrect, but we have a ton of extra words in here that we can make, or that we could reduce, remove, or replace to make the sentence clearer. So for instance, in this section right here, we have, in order to see if there was a new bicycle. We could just say to see. So we could say Dave walked over into the backyard of the school to see if there was a new bike, or to find a new bicycle for class, excuse me. We do multiple different fixes here, right? But again, we have 8 words here where anywhere from 2 to 4 could drastically improve the sentence while saying the exact same thing. Yes, we're going to take a look at some different fixes. And Chelsea put into the chat, Dave walked to the school's backyard to find a new bicycle for class. This is different than I would, that's different than I would do, which is totally fine. This is one of the best and worst things about sticky sentences is there isn't one way to fix them. So we're going to put in some examples of how to fix the sentence in just a second. But the good thing is, again, there's not one way to fix it. So every single one of us on this webinar, all 119 of us, could have very different ways of fixing it, which is fine, which means that we retain our authorial voice. We can make a decision about what's important for us. But that also means that, as a writer, you have a lot of different options for fixing it. And you have to really kind of think critically about a sticky sentence to figure out what the meaning is and then make the fix yourself. So let's just go ahead and do what a few folks have already started doing in the chat. Let's fix the sentence. So if we think about sticky sentences and we think about the sentence, our glue words, our working words, how would you rewrite the sentence? A few folks have already popped that in, but it'll give everyone else about a minute to think through how they would rewrite this, and you can drop your new sentence into the chat. So we had Dave walked to the school's backyard to find a new bicycle for class. Dave walked to the schoolyard to find a new bicycle for class. 2 great options. Dave walked to the backyard of school to find a new bicycle to use in class. Yep, again, cutting glue words. Dave walked to the backyard of the school to find a new bicycle for class. Yep. Dave entered the schoolyard to find a new bicycle for class. Dave walked into schoolyard to find a new bicycle for class. Dave walked to the schoolyard to find a new bicycle for class. Dave walked into the school's backyard to find a new bicycle for class. Here's what I came up with. Dave checked the school's backyard for a new bicycle to use in class. Yeah, so we had to find a new bicycle for class. Dave checked into the backyard of school. Again, we've had about, I think, like 10 or 11 different versions here. Every single one of ours is a little bit different than everyone else's, and every single version is better, right? So again, that's kind of what I was saying with sticky sentences. They are really exciting because you have a lot of opportunities to effectively change them. They can also be very frustrating to fix because there's not one right answer, right? But again, I think it's ultimately a very good thing that there are many options as a writer to choose kind of what is best for you in your story. So how do you fix this yourself? And I know that there's a number of questions in the chat which I'll get to in a second about sticky sentences. So exactly as someone's just saying, sticky sentences, how you change it is going to depend on the context of the piece. So the first thing I want to highlight is that you might decide that a sticky sentence is totally fine to leave in. Just like passive voice, you might decide the sentence is fine as it is and you could leave it alone. If you're considering that a sentence might be too sticky, here's what I would recommend. First, have a look through your writing for anything that is overly long. Now, overly long is context dependent. So overly long for a kid's book is going to be different than overly long for an academic paper. But a general rule of thumb, if you're writing from anywhere from YA to adult, is that if a sentence is over 18 words long, it's probably too long. If you're writing middle grade or kid lit, over 18 words is almost definitely too long. But again, YA and beyond, anything over 18 words is probably too long. Once you've found sentences like that, I would look for glue words. So words like prepositions, conjunctions, articles. Those are all those words that, again, they make the sentence stick together, but you can often reduce, remove, or replace them to make the sentence make sense. And then you're going to rewrite the sentence to reduce those glue words. Like I said, there's not one way to do this. You might decide that you do not want to change the sentence at all, and it makes sense to have it there. But your goal, again, is to understand the context of your sentence and whether or not it makes sense to leave them in. Before I get into how to fix this with ProWritingAid, because I've seen a lot of people who have had questions on this, I want to talk about glue word sentences in dialogue. So a couple of people have asked, are glue words acceptable in dialogue? How do sticky sentences relate with dialogue tags? Great questions. It's totally, yes, totally dependent on, or it can be totally different for dialogue versus like the rest of your prose. We as people often add glue words. I'm sure if you printed out a transcript of what I'm saying on this webinar, almost like every other word would be a glue word. I saw that somebody said that, like, like all of these filler words that I'm throwing in, which I just threw another one in. Those are all glue words. I can reduce, remove, or replace them. It's very hard to do as you're speaking. And then it's also, something that's going to make your characters often sound more real if they have those glue words in there. So you can choose to ignore glue words in dialogue. So if if you're running ProWritingAid and you're seeing that you have, a high glue index, you could choose to just ignore them because it's fine. We don't, I believe, have in our settings, you can ignore certain things in dialogue, but you can't ignore glue words specifically. That being said, that's fine. Again, you could just choose to ignore it yourself. So that was the first thing about glue words in dialogue. Totally okay to have more. I would suggest, a lot of times, we want our dialogue to sound natural, but we also want our dialogue to be readable as well. So think about, is this sentence too long? Is there a better way for my character to express X, Y, or Z? If they're using a lot of glue words, why are they using a lot of glue words? Are those glue words like good realistic dialogue is going to be dialogue that shows us more about the character? Glue words might not show us more about the character. So again, you could ignore glue words within your dialogue, but I would suggest taking a look at that and thinking about, does this actually get across what I'm trying to get across? Okay, someone also asked about a printable list of common glue words. We do. Let me see if I can find it. Let me see. You know what? We used to have one, Steph. I'll try to find it later. I'm not going to be able to find it really easily on this webinar, but we do have one on our blog somewhere. So with all of these things, okay, so somebody had also asked what's a good glue index. So typically we recommend having a glue index of 40% or less, which means about 40% of the words in your document are glue words, 60% are working. That is an overall index for your document. So so sentence to sentence could vary greatly. And again, it doesn't mean that your document is bad by any means. If you have over 45% glue or over 40% glue words, you could decide that it's just fine. What I would recommend, so where I am looking at this right now is in our goals sidebar here on the right, and I can see that I have a glue index of 45%. And if I click on that, it will open up the sticky sentences check, and I'll see how many sticky and semi-sticky sentences I have. Now, ProWritingAid says that a sticky sentence is something that has 60% above or above glue words. I would almost definitely take a look at the 60% or above. Semi is between 40 and 60. In this instance, you might decide it's fine, it's close enough, and you don't necessarily need to look at those. But the sticky ones I would definitely look at. And then when you highlight a sticky sentence, it will show you how many of the words are glue words versus working words. And it might also, depending on the sentence, suggest a way to rewrite it using fewer glue words. Again, this is completely up to your discretion. So you could take the ProWritingAid suggestion, you could ignore the ProWritingAid suggestion. It's up to you. But it does, again, recognize places where you have sticky sentences and then improve them. Now, I also want to say that one of my favorite ways, let me see if I can find one. One of my favorite ways to improve sticky sentences as well is through the real-time checker. So our real-time checker also finds instances where you have readability errors or style errors that errors is not even style improvements that could make your writing more effective. And a lot of times these are glue words. So for instance, additional words where you don't need them. Here's a good example. Right now we have 4 words saying things that one word could say. So a lot of times I'll use both. And what I will often do is come in here and use the real-time checker and make some of those style improvements first before I then go into the sticky sentences check, because your glue index will likely get better as you eliminate some of those stylistic improvements in your real-time report. Okay, we can go back to more questions on sticky sentences in a bit, but I do want to keep moving since we are coming up on time. So we talked about how to fix sticky sentences with ProWritingAid. Let's talk about using powerful verbs. So just like subjects are the stars of our sentences, verbs are the engines of our writing. So many writers, unfortunately, including myself, tend to use weak verbs instead of strong verbs. This can take place in 2 different ways. The first is by hiding your verbs, which is a process known as nominalization, which also, by the way, can contribute to sticky sentences, because nominalizations are basically when you take a verb and you make it a much more complicated phrase. So in this sentence, instead of saying we will announce the winner on Friday, I've written, we will make an announcement of the winner on Friday. In this case, we've hidden the verb announce, and we've made this much more complicated phrase, make an announcement of, right? So we've said basically 4 words where just one powerful word, announce, will do. So this is something that's really, really common. We say this a lot in our speaking. We often will throw these into our writing all the time. And again, it's not incorrect, but it is typically saying something that's more complicated and taking the power out of the verb. We will also use, writers often tend to use weak verbs that need an adverb or a word like very to kind of make them make sense or to give them more meaning. So instead of saying I dashed towards the bus, saying I ran quickly towards the bus. Again, neither of these are incorrect, but they do tend to take the power away from your verbs and make them less effective. We should always try to let our verbs power our writing by showing them. So finding places where we can remove nominalizations. So instead of saying we will make an announcement of the winner on Friday, saying we will announce the winner on Friday. Instead of saying I ran quickly towards the bus, I dashed towards the bus. Picking words that say what you mean will make your prose more exciting, more engaging, and will say more clear for your readers. Now, we will, let me see if I have a nominalization in here. I might have already fixed all of them, but ProWritingAid does have a bunch of different ways to fix this. So Patricia has the power of a thesaurus. That's a great example. Oh, here's a sticky word that we could just remove. I know somebody had said that was one of those. Let's see. I could probably put that sentence. I will make an announcement. See if this will catch my nominalization in there. might take a second to find it. We can also, let's see, find places where we have, again, more effective writing. I know it is often more difficult. All right, I don't want to waste too much time finding them. But again, there are many instances where ProWritingAid can find, again, places where you've used nominalizations. It can also find places where you have used adverbs to, again, improve your verbs, right? And where you can, like Patricia was saying, find a word that makes more sense. Now, ProWritingAid also has a thesaurus, but my favorite word, or one of my favorite features, is the word explorer. So this is kind of like a secret one. So if you highlight any word, so I just am double clicking on bike here, I can click word explorer, and this is going to pull up a bunch of different options. So first it's going to pull up a definition for it. It will then also pull up a thesaurus. Bike is probably not a good example of a word that has a lot of options, but then it will also pull up a bunch of different ways to use it. Forms using the word, it will pull up words that rhyme with it. It will pull up pronunciation. It will pull up common phrases using the word. It will pull up examples of the word in quotes from books, etc., which are really, really effective. And this is not a new feature, but it is one that people just don't use very often. So again, any word. So I'm just going to do happy, which is will have many more synonyms. Or many more, things that we can explore in the thesaurus. There's just dozens and dozens of words. So if you found something where you've used very and you're just not quite sure what you want to say, coming in and using the thesaurus or the word explorer is really, really helpful to finding more effective words. Okay, let's keep going. We've got 2 more principles to cover, and then we have a few questions as well. So our 4th principle is to target correct readability. So audiences often prefer works that are easy to read, and this is something that's really hard for writers to get their minds around. And I often think that this is because, when we start out as writers in class or that type of thing, it's really easy for us to think that we need to show off our fancy vocabulary, or we need to write really long sentences. I remember when I was, in high school and stuff like that, I would try to write and make my grade level as high as I possibly could in Word spell checker, because I thought that meant I had a good paper. But that's not true. It could not be further from the truth. Good writing is actually often easier to read rather than harder to read. So what does it mean when I say kind of readability, or when something is easy to read? What I'm really saying are these 3 things. First, your ideas are the stars. So readable work is work that lets ideas shine instead of word choice. So here you're not making your reader pull up their word explorer or their thesaurus. They're just there. They're enmeshed in your ideas. The second thing that readable work means is that you've chosen your words carefully. Now, you do not have to forego all interesting words. You can go Explorer, you can pick out engaging words, but you should make sure that you are choosy about the words that you decide to make more complicated. If you make every single word more complicated, your readability is just going to be too difficult and audiences are going to get frustrated. But if you want to use a specific word to, again, state something specific about a character, or just make your sentence more interesting, or choose a domain-specific word that will add to your ambiance, all of that is fine. Just make sure you're choosing the words that are, a little bit more complicated or a little bit more rare carefully. And then finally, readability means targeting your specific audience. So like I talked about at the beginning, every audience is going to be different. The more you consider who your audience is, the better. So if you're writing for 7th graders, you should probably write a little below 7th grade. If you're writing for adults who read a lot of science fiction, they're probably going to have a different set of terms that they're comfortable with than an audience who typically reads romance, right? So consider who your audience is when you're choosing what to target. And then readability doesn't mean, on the other hand, that your prose is boring or dumbed down. This is something I hear a lot from people when I talk about readability. They worry that that means that they can't choose any unique words. Not at all. You have to make sure that you are choosing unique words consciously. And then finally, you can have very complicated ideas, but you just need to make sure that you're using clear language to get those across. So how do you figure out readability? I would recommend using something called a readability score. So readability score is something that will predict who will read your audience. It basically just is like a score that spits out and says, people who are 12 years old would be able to read this. There are many types of readability scores to choose from, but they all do basically the same thing, which is, again, show who would be able to read your writing. Now, if you have run your work through a readability checker, there's a lot of things to do to fit. The good thing about readability is that not just one thing will fix your sentence or will fix your readability level. It is multiple things that you can look at. The first thing, and one of the easiest things to look at, is vocabulary. Using an easier vocabulary will often make your writing more effective and easier to read, will bring down that readability score. Long sentences also tend to make your readability score more high. So you can, shorten your sentences to reduce your readability score. Then jargon can also tend to increase your readability score. And again, if you're trying to have a lower readability score, removing jargon can help. And then again, passive voice tends to make your sentences longer, more complicated. So switching your sentences to active voice will also make your readability score go down. And then with ProWritingAid, you can do a couple of different things. So a lot of the suggestions I was showing, again, the passive voice suggestions. Let's see if I can find another. Let me get another sample in here. Okay, so here we have a different sample. So just to show you a few things, I had talked about the word very before, so I would typically do frosty or something better. Here's a readability improvement because we have too many words, so we can just switch to many. Here's another readability improvement we can make. So the real-time checker has a bunch of different options for improving readability. Here's probably another one. So it can find phrases like to and fro that are a little bit more jargony. And then you can also find your readability score. So I have general, I had it on science fiction. I've now switched to general. And I see a couple people in here are asking what's the general grade limit to aim for. Most writing for adults is going to be about 7th grade, which again does not mean that it is for 12-year-olds, but means that 12-year-olds could understand the sentences. So romance, obviously, you're probably going to have content you don't want a 12-year-old to read in a romance novel, but that's okay. It just means that the prose is set up so a 12-year-old could read it if they did. Now, the goals sidebar here on the right is great because it gives you, where did it go? It gives you a range for the correct readability for this particular type of writing. So again, it's not like you always have to be exactly at 7th grade, but this will tell outside of the range. So 10th grade here you can see, which is in the US about 14, 15-year-olds. That's kind of the high end of what you would want a general fiction grade limit to aim for. So you can come in here and you can see, hey, I'm actually in the target. Or you could say, you know what, I'm a little too high. My audience, I'm writing for YA or something like that. I kind of want to bring it down. And then you could go lower. Or, you could say, hey, I'm out here at 12th grade and, what's recommended for my document type is very different. So I need to bring it in. So again, this will show you kind of the range, though, the kind of common understanding is that most fiction books written for mass market audiences are about 7th grade reading level, which is again lower than most people think. And so, if you see this and you see your readability is higher, you can click in and you can find each paragraph, what's difficult to read, what's slightly difficult, or what's very difficult to read. And then again, if I come back into the real-time checker, this is where I'm going to make a lot of those style improvements that will improve readability. Okay, let's talk about our final principle and then we'll go into questions. So our final principle is to choose specific words. And this is a fun one because we've been talking about cutting. We've been talking about all the things we can get rid of or simplify, but now we're going to talk about what we can add back in. So clarity, as we talked about in the beginning, is not just about making things simple. It's also about making them specific. Vague words are words that lack the specificity our readers need to understand to play that correct movie. So here is a very vague sentence. It's not an incorrect sentence, but it's a very vague sentence. Kate made some improvements to her cabin and it's now worth more. So tell me in the chat, what do you picture when you picture Kate making some improvements to her cabin? What does that mean to you? A new advertisement for the cabin. Some sort of construction. Someone's going to read a whole different author. Curtains, rooms to the cabin. Somebody has no idea. decoration, construction, redecorating. No idea what improvements are made. Paint, cleanup, refurb of construction, redecorating. Yeah, we have a whole bunch of different ideas here. Finally got rid of the outhouse. Yeah, that could be great, Tanya. A new partner. Yep, that could definitely, that could definitely rise the property value for sure. And just like Sherry's saying, it's a guess, right? Some improvements could mean absolutely anything, right? For this sentence, I always like to say, my mom is an architect. She's like a Harvard and MIT trained architect. She's super smart. She's got great design. So for her, some improvements probably means that she's gutting the place and like installing floor to ceiling windows. Whereas for me, I am a millennial who's never owned a home. So some improvements means like cleaning up the pizza box, right? So it's very, very different. And this sentence is going to be way too vague for a reader because they have absolutely no idea. They could have every single, example that we just showed in the chat, and it's not going to be specific enough. So this is a fine sentence. It's not incorrect, but it doesn't give our readers any of the information they need. So now if we have a more specific picture, we can kind of guess what we're saying. So we can now see Kate replacing the bathroom, repainting the living room, laying hardwood floors, increasing its value by 10%, right? Now we have a very, very clear picture of what Kate is doing. We might argue in the chat over whether she's painting the living room, green or gray or white, but it's not really going to matter for the understanding of the sentence. Or if it does, you could just add it back in. But we have a much more specific sentence here where we can kind of close our eyes and picture exactly what Kate's doing. And all of us are going to get closer to what Kate is actually doing than what we did before, where with, every single other person, we had a different idea. So what I want us to end with as we get into questions is the idea that clarity is not always brevity. A lot of times clarity does mean cutting out extraneous pieces or finding more specific and more clear sentence constructions, but it doesn't always mean that you have to be really brief. It also means that you need to choose words that mean what you say. So you have to be doing both of those things all the time. Not just cutting, but also choosing words that mean what you say. And again, if we actually go back to this sentence had a higher glue index than this sentence because we couldn't reduce, remove, or replace a lot of these words. Like we couldn't change repainted to resanded or refloored or added bookshelves or something because it would change the meaning. We couldn't change living room to kitchen because that would change the meaning. Hardwood to marble, that would change the meaning, right? So this sentence actually has fewer glue words than the other one does, even though it's longer. So again, clarity does not always equal brevity. You have to be doing both things. You have to be thinking, what are the words that say what I mean? And how can I put them in an order in this sentence that is not going to, alienate the reader or be too. And when you're thinking about specificity, it is very challenging. But one of the things that you can do if you're fixing this yourself is ask yourself after reading a passage, is the movie a reader playing in their head accurate to what I'm trying to show? And ask yourself, could a reader be playing a different movie than the movie I intend, right? So if you're using words like some, that'll probably tell you that the reader could be playing a completely different movie than the movie that you're trying to show. So this is the best way to think about how to make your sentence as effective as possible. Now, of course, before we get into questions, ProWritingAid can help with that. So our real-time checker will find instances where you are too vague. And then you can also go specifically into the diction report, which will find vague and abstract words in your writing so you can find them and fix them. And then again, the real-time checker will find places where you say things that are, maybe this is one. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find one right now, but yes, it'll find places where you are being too vague and give you options to make those more effective. Okay, so let's see. I wanted to show you a couple of other quick things that I particularly like to use as a fiction writer. So I use the echoes report all the time. I tend to repeat myself a lot. And so the echoes report will come and find places where you have repeated yourself with words. You can also use the all repeats to find phrases that you have repeated. So, if you are using the phrase turquoise eyes 100 times to describe your, main love interest, it can find those and give you a place to say like eyes or something else instead. I also use the sensory report a lot of times as a fiction writer. This will tell you how many sense words you use. As fiction writers, we tend to use way too many sight words as opposed to others. So I don't even have any smell words in here, which could be good to round out the setting and make it more believable. And I'm obviously way higher on sight than I am on the others. So it can kind of help you to balance those out, which are just other things that I really use a ton of as a fiction writer. And with all of that being said, let's go into questions. And I'm just going to put the, let's see, I'm just going to put in here as well. And David has a great point that the knowing your audience is really important. So I had seen someone say in the chat that the grade level was 4+, but the students were not able to understand what you're saying. So readability is a predictor of who will understand something, but it's not a guarantee. So if students are unable to, read or understand what you're trying to say, even though your readability score is in the right, is in the right kind of range, I would take a look at what your actual ideas are and how you've set up the construction of your sentence. For instance, a sticky sentence could have a sentence, or could be a sentence that had the very low readability, but that does not mean that that sticky sentence is easy to understand. So you could say, hey, I'm actually using too many glue words. And so my sentences are too long, even though they're easy to read, right? Because readability, remember, is not just one thing. It's not just length. It's not just words. It's all of that. So you could be using really, really easy words, but there's too many of them, or the construction is too difficult, or it's too vague as well. That's another thing that I often see is people are using too many vague words as well. So consider all of that, because again, remember, readability is not a guarantee that people will understand it. It's a predictor of who will. Okay. So Elaine asks, do you suggest doing a real-time report and correcting everything at once, or going through and focusing on a couple corrections at a time? Elaine, I use ProWritingAid differently depending on whether I am writing for work or whether I'm writing for pleasure, so fiction. I often say on these that I'm very precious about my fiction, so I cannot handle the real-time checker. So when I am writing fiction, I do not have the real-time checker on because I cannot handle it. I do not want to see these these underlines, because I would just never write anything. So I turn real-time off like this when I'm writing fiction. And then I come back, and when I'm ready to edit my fiction, I will turn the real-time checker on. I'll come over here to the goals to kind of get a sense of where I am in the correct range and where I'm outside of the correct range. So that'll tell me where I should spend time. So I'm like way out for dialogue tags. So I'll probably spend some time on dialogue tags, whereas I am okay with passive voice. So while there might be a few passive voice instances here, I'm probably going to ignore them because I'm in this range. That being said, when I write blog posts or emails for work, I have real-time checker on all the time because I'm not as precious and afraid to see corrections as that when that happens. So all of those options are totally okay. You can also choose the reports that you want, like someone's saying in the chat. Sometimes people will set up a combo report, which is just all of their favorite reports, and just run that one. There's really kind of an infinite ways to do that. Okay. Someone asked what style guide we use. So ProWritingAid doesn't use a specific style guide. What it does is it runs against basically thousands of texts in fantasy to create these ranges. So it'll look at, like, our language processing team basically uses thousands and thousands of different texts in fantasy to find what the ranges for sentence length for fantasy were. You can create your own style guide if you would like to. So if you want to follow APA or MLA, you can do that. And then we are actually also we should hopefully be releasing soon some APA and MLA style guides within here as well, but you can create them yourselves for right now. Okay. Someone asked, how can I use foreign languages as part of my text? So ProWritingAid is only in English right now, but you can add any word you would like. So this is obviously an incorrect word, but I could just hit here to add it to your dictionary. So if you have a foreign language that you would like to use, and it's flagging those words, you can just remove them or add them to your dictionary. You can also switch the type of English. So if you are, US writing a story about British people or Australians or vice versa or whatever, you can switch there. We use that a lot at ProWritingAid because our team is divided between the UK and the US. So we are always going back and forth. Okay. Is there a place to default to using curly apostrophes? Yes. If you come up here to the menu, you can click use curly quotes, or you can convert everything by converting to straight, or you convert everything to curly. Okay, so Pauline says, is there a trick to the ignore function? So it'll remember the ignores within the session that you're using them, though it will, if you make changes to the text or if you reopen it, they will appear. I will also say with ignores, it's kind of hard because for something like passive voice, for instance, there's like thousands of passive voice instances coded into our software. So even if you ignored one passive voice instance, it might not ignore all the other passive voice instances because of how kind of that functionality works. But if you come in here into any of your reports and you just don't want to see a particular suggestion, you can just hit this little I here and then you'll stop seeing them. So I say you don't want to see any passive voice suggestions, just hover over and they'll disappear. And that works for any of these. So if you, this is not a good example, but if you looked at like grammar checks and didn't want to see any grammar issues, just hover over the I and then they'll all disappear, or hover over the spelling and they'll all disappear. Okay. Let's see. So someone asked, how do we eliminate dialogue tags without confusing the reader as to who is speaking? So I would say that with dialogue tags are kind of like signposts, and that's how I like to think about them. You know, on a road, you don't see a signpost every 2 feet. You see one when the road changes. And so that's how I typically tend to think about dialogue tags. Think about putting them when the speakers are changing, and it's not clear who's changing, or when a new speaker is introduced. Or if you have extra information that not the tag itself, but that the action of the speaker could help. So it's not always like, you don't always have to say Hayley said, you know, you could say, you know, you could add like Hayley slammed her fist after, right? It doesn't always have to be a dialogue tag. It could be action that's adding to that as well. Someone says, how long does it generally take to add a 100,000 word fiction novel by yourself versus with ProWritingAid? Honestly, that is so subjective. I wish I had a clear answer for you. I will say it's probably going to take longer with ProWritingAid, but that's a good thing because I think it'll find things that you wouldn't find yourself. I think a lot of times when we're editing ourselves, we just focus on spelling, grammar errors, but we won't be fixing all of these bad habits. I think as writers, we often have bad habits and we just don't see them. So something like an echo or a repeat is really hard to sense yourself. And, you know, deciding, yes, I think Sandra says this perfectly in the chat. It's longer during the edit, but you end up with less rounds of editing. I think that's the perfect way to say it. Like, you're going to go through and have probably far more edits than you would have by yourself, but your work is going to be better at the end, and you will probably only have to edit it a few times rather than a bunch. Okay, we are out of time, and I just want to quickly look at some of the others because a couple people have asked how many things to edit at once. And the person who was just talking about how long it'll take to edit 100,000 words, don't edit 100,000 words at one time, please, either by yourself or with ProWritingAid. It'll take far too long and it'll go cross-eyed and it'll just be really hard for you. So I typically edit a chapter at a time with fiction. You can highlight a specific text, so you can just highlight what you want to edit if you'd like to go a little smaller than a chapter or a little smaller than a section. And really quickly before we go, I know a bunch of people have asked about integrations. So this is the web editor. You can also use this in Microsoft Word. We have a desktop app. We have a Chrome extension. And for all of you who are using Scrivener, we are testing out a desktop app. Right now, our desktop app lets you edit Scrivener files, but we're actually going to hopefully very soon have an integration right in Scrivener itself too, which is going to be so exciting. So all of that being said, please feel free to use the link that I just sent, hold on, to upgrade is 25% off for ProWritingAid right now. It's a really great deal. We also have a lifetime license, which people, most competitors do not have, which covers all integrations, all updates from now until forever. Or there's 25% off yearly as well. Or you can just get started for a month with $20, which will be great. All right. Thank you all so much. It was so great to see you. This replay will be going out after this, so please feel free to check that out. The discount is good for 1 week, so feel free to check that out. And thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.